Welcome to History Class with Dr. W. and our continuing discussion of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era. In the last few lectures, I've talked a lot about how the nation was becoming more organized during the Gilded Age. Big businesses combining and forming pools and cartels and holding companies. Laborers and workers forming unions to try to organize and improve their working conditions. There's one other area where we start to see some organization during this time, and it's here that I want to focus in this last portion of this lecture, the organization occurring in the West. While I've spent quite a bit of time talking about the cities and the growing businesses and factories and plants and manufacturing within the cities, it's important to note that during this era still most of the nation made its living through farming, and most Americans still lived in the countryside. I mentioned that many people were starting farms as they filled up the West. The federal government, to encourage people to settle this land, was giving away land during the 1860s. Under the Homestead Act of 1862, any American citizen could receive a grant of 160 acres of land if he stayed on that land for 7 years and began to develop it. So people were moving to the country in droves and settling under this act. But let's try to get a better picture of what it was like for people who were undertaking those efforts. So if we think about 160 acres, which is some 15 square miles, if you line up those plots of land next to each other, you could wind up being 15 miles or so from your nearest neighbor. And you could be dozens or even hundreds of miles away from the nearest city or town. There were still few, if any, roads. As I've mentioned a number of times, there aren't automobiles yet, there's no highway system. There were few paved roads of any kind once you got out of the major cities. Most of the plots of land supplied by the Homestead Act didn't include a whole lot of supplies or raw materials, so things such as wood and water were scarce. So what could one build with? Well, many of those early pioneers started out just by digging a hole in the ground and building sod houses, which were constructed from squares of sod cut out of the ground and stacked together. Obviously, and of course in the rain, this was not a good situation. Winters could be brutal out there on the plains. There were plagues of locusts and grasshoppers. But the worst problem may well have been the isolation and loneliness. Living some 15 miles from your nearest neighbor, hundreds of miles away from a city or town, many of the settlers, particularly women, slipped into despair and lost touch with reality. Partly to combat this loneliness, and partly to combat their economic troubles, farmers began to organize in the years after the Civil War. The sprawling group of farmers just kept producing and producing wheat crops, and prices kept falling and falling. So beginning in the late 1860s and into the 1870s, they formed an organization called the Patrons of Husbandry, also known as the Grange. They tried to elect officials to state legislatures and change laws, but met only minimal success in the beginning. In the 1880s, several regional organizations became prominent, and in the 1890s, these regional organizations began to merge to form the Populists. It's a group and also becomes a political party of the same name, the Populist Party. The Populists formed a strong lobbying force, and they had a number of objectives. They wanted the government to create warehouses which would store surplus crops until prices improved and would give greater stabilization to agricultural prices. They also called for the free and unlimited coinage of silver, which would inflate the currency and make it easier to pay off their debts. Remember, as many of these farmers, most of them, found themselves in debt. They called for greater government control of transportation and called upon the government to stop giving land to the railroads. For a time, the Populist Party became a significant third party in the country, particularly in the more sparsely populated states of the American West. During the 1890s, the Populist Party lobbied for the needs of the farming community, although they didn't meet with great success on the national level, and they were panned by the press of the big cities of the East in cartoons like the one pictured on this screen. The 1893 Depression hit hard among farmers of the West, and President Grover Cleveland really didn't know how to handle the Depression, his policies only making things worse. Coming out of that depression, we see one last story that I want to talk about to illustrate the organization of the West during this time. In May of 1894, before the Pullman strike, an Ohioan named Jacob Coxey organized a march to Washington to protest the handling of the Depression. This is really the first organized march on Washington. It was referred to in the press as a 20-ring circus with half a dozen sideshows. Coxey led this army of unemployed to Washington to argue for a bill to build roads, which would both help unemployment as well as ease some of the conditions in the West. The names associated with Coxey's march alone tell us something about the men in charge, and Coxey himself was a bit wacky. One of his friends was named Carl Brown, who was nicknamed Old Greasy and wore a Buffalo Bill outfit. Another was named Christopher Columbus Jones. And Coxey himself named his child Legal Tender Coxey, which I suppose was a girl's name, as this was his daughter. The end of the story is somewhat anticlimactic, as Grover Cleveland, the president, botched things yet again, having Coxey and his fellow marchers arrested for walking on the grass, and the march ended unsuccessfully. So we see that the late 19th century was a time of tremendous growth and of incredible wealth and prosperity for a select group of businessmen. But for most, times were hard. For Native Americans, for African Americans, for workers, and for farmers. For now, big business had the upper hand. As we'll see in future lectures, eventually labor and unions began to have success in gaining better pay, hours, and working conditions. But that would have to wait until progressive reformers had their say, which I'll discuss in future lectures.